The terror attack on buses helping to evacuate a number of towns in Syria, which killed as many as 80 children on Saturday, has been widely condemned by humanitarian organisations. The UN has called for greater protection for children across the country. The huge blast targeted civilians waiting to leave rebel-held areas, according to a deal struck between the government and opposition forces.
There are so many dead here from the Free Syrian Army, also civilians, women and children. It's a horrific picture that just can't be described.
This is one of the worst, most horrifying massacres. We urge our president, Assad, to help our families out. What happened can't be described. Oh dear God, we don't know what to do.
Well, we can now cross live to our correspondent in Damascus, the Syrian capital, Lizzie Phelan. Good afternoon, Lizzie. What more do we know about the reaction? What kind of sense are we getting to what happened in Aleppo province on Saturday?
Hi, Yunan. Well, we're seeing a very different reaction by both the media and institutions around the world to this attack and the chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun. Now, in the aftermath of that chemical attack, of course, before any investigation could possibly have been conducted, the mainstream media immediately began pinning the blame on the Syrian government, an attribution which essentially justified the American government firing scores of Tomahawk cruise missiles at Syrian government territory that also killed several civilians. Now, this weekend, of course, we've seen another horrific crime, this time an attack on civilians from two besieged towns, Fua and Kafrea. Those people were stuck in rebel-held territory waiting to be evacuated to government territory when an explosion went off, just at the same time when many children were gathering around a van that was distributing potato chips. And of course, as we know now, the vast majority of those many victims of the attack were children. Now, despite that fact, of course, that both the children from Khan Sheikhoun and the children from Fua and Kafrea, both innocent children, victims of horrific murders. Nevertheless, to date, we haven't seen the American ambassador to the UN holding up the pictures of those children from Fua and Kafrea as she did for the children from Khan Sheikhoun. And could that be because in this case it's very difficult to pin the blame on the Syrian government? Now, even in the case of the chemical attack, there still is a notable lack of evidence that the Syrian government was responsible there, but that still hasn't held the mainstream media back from running headlines apportioning blame to the Syrian government. And they've been happy to use virtually any account that has backed up that narrative, even when the source of such claims is highly questionable, as we've seen with the most often cited source, the case of a doctor often quoted in the media, despite the fact that that doctor is known to have previously been facing charges in the UK for his alleged role in the kidnap of a Dutch and British journalist in Syria. Meanwhile, in the case of this attack on the civilians from Fua and Kafrea, the evidence of who was behind that attack has either been dismissed or downplayed by the mainstream media. Even the deaths of those civilians, those children, has been trivialized by the media.
We have since heard that the evacuation process is continuing despite this, you would say, hiccup but disastrous moment in it, punctuating it.
So what evidence do we have about who was responsible for what happened on Saturday for this terrible massacre? Now, some have claimed, these claims cited in the mainstream media, that the vehicle that was detonated came from government territory. Meanwhile, Syria watchers on Twitter have challenged that claim using photos and diagrams to indicate that, in fact, the suicide vehicle that was detonated came from rebel-held territory. We also have the accounts of refugees from Fua and Kafraya who were at the scene at the time, who say that rebels sought to maximize the casualties on that day by luring starving children to that van that was distributing potato chips. And of course, this wouldn't be the first time that rebels have targeted civilians from Fua and Kafraya. Those are two Shia towns that opposition forces have frequently incited murder against. Back in December, one of the buses evacuating civilians from Fua and Kafraya was also torched, and rebels at the time warned the world that they would do the same again if they tried to have civilians from Fua and Kafraya evacuated again. Meanwhile, just a few days before this attack, the darlings of the mainstream media, the Oscar award-winning White Helmets, were seen protesting this deal that was supposed to see civilians from both Fua and Kafraya and rebel-held territory evacuated to alleviate their suffering. Yet we haven't seen that video being circulated or being published by the mainstream media. So yet again, we're seeing double standards on the part of the media when it comes to how they handle evidence of who is responsible for horrific crimes in terms of how it fits their agenda.
Our Syria correspondent Lizzie Phelan bringing us right up to date to the reaction of what occurred on Saturday in Syria. Let's cross live now to Martin Jay, Middle East expert and journalist. Hi, Martin. So let's get into this, what we've just been hearing there from Lizzie speaking about. The Western media does seem to have a tendency to avoid blaming rebels or incidents coming from rebel-held areas, such as Saturday's attack. But when it comes to Assad, the media, always does try to put the blame on the president, even if there is no evidence. It does beg the question, why?
Well, I think you're too kind. I think Western media for the last 6 years or so has really indulged itself and got trapped in its own echo chamber in how it reports on Syria and how it stigmatized the Assad government by being essentially the root cause of the problem, and how it reports anything from the opposition side as largely more or less the victims, and those fighters, whether they're extremists or not, doing more or less a noble job. And this is what we've seen here today. I mean, it's completely biased reporting of what is a tragic, heart-wrenching story. And I think we're going to see we're stuck in that echo chamber, and nothing's really changed. If you look at how Western media reported on, for example, Russian bombing in Aleppo, and how it's so thoroughly and it was so obsessed with reporting on civilian casualties, but then wasn't quite so assiduous in its reporting on US bombing in Mosul. You have a good example of rank hypocrisy, and this is what we're seeing here today.
After the alleged chemical attack earlier this month, there was no investigation or evidence brought forward that Assad was behind it, but the US president took unilateral action against him. We saw that missile strike. But when as many as 80 children, Martin, are killed in a suicide attack, we don't hear, or we have not heard from Donald Trump. Your thoughts on that?
Look, I think he doesn't seem to follow the events very closely. I don't think his people are bringing him up to speed. I think he's very, very selective in how he sees the Middle East, and in particular Syria. It worries me how he just very casually in interviews with American journalists confuses Syria and Iraq. So I don't think he gets all of the picture, and I don't think particularly he wants all of the picture. I think he has a very, very limited bandwidth on what he seems and what he perceives to be important news, and this hasn't reached his radar screen. There's been a statement from Washington, but it's such a cursory reference and hardly a really a serious point of view at all from America. They haven't really seemed to have taken any position on what is a massacre. I mean, there's no other way of describing it.
Just as you're speaking, we're seeing some horrific images, but also pictures of the US ambassador to the UN showing pictures of dead children during an attack in Syria. Do you think we're going to see Western ambassadors bringing photos of children who died in this latest attack on Saturday into the UN Security Council and showing them like Nikki Haley did?
I can't imagine it. I mean, I think if that were to happen and a new impetus, a new momentum to this whole subject was brought, what came about from doing something as controversial and as polemic as that, then I think a whole load of really awkward, difficult questions have to be asked by journalists, have to be asked by the White House and Pentagon and Trump's people, which is what exactly is the relationship between the Trump administration and these groups, these opposition groups who are responsible for these massacres, like al-Nusra or others in that area. You know, those are the sort of questions which journalists aren't asking and Trump isn't prepared to answer. But that, for me, is really the core of this issue. You know, every geopolitical expert or journalist in this part of the world knows perfectly well that al-Nusra and other extremist groups are funded indirectly by the West via Qatar and Saudi Arabia. It's nothing new. I mean, we're not breaking news here. You know, so I think that's a tougher question for Trump to answer. On the question of the photographs, I don't think anyone's going to present those photographs at any UN Council, but I would imagine quite a few people will be photoshopping them now, so that Nikki Haley is in fact holding them up, and we'll see that on social media probably in the next few hours.
And just to press on a point that we spoke about, Martin, when government forces are said to be involved, the US does prefer to act without investigation, as we saw in the last number of weeks. But when rebels are implicated or said to be involved, people are still dying, the images are still coming out, but there are no calls for a probe. It's hard to digest that.
It's a cover-up, I think. I mean, as I said earlier, I think this relationship between a lot of these opposition groups, the more extremist ones who carried out this massacre, and the West is a question that we should be asking. And I think that feeds into the bias, that feeds into the sloppy journalism by biased Western media, and also by the various administrations, not only just in Washington but also in Paris and in London. You know, we have to look at what the West is doing in northern Syria and see whether we can really we can really trust some of these extremist groups. You know, and Trump seems to be very confused. He's bumming the Assad regime. He's made a declaration that he wants to hit ISIS, but you know, there's a cigarette paper, ideologically speaking, between ISIS and many of these extremist groups like Nusra. So I think there should be, ideally, a call for clarity here as we move forward. You know, there's a lot of ambiguity, and that's why you're not getting clear messages from Washington. That's why you're not getting objective reporting when we report on these so-called incidents.
Martin Jay, Middle East expert and journalist, thank you very much for coming on the programme and sharing your thoughts this hour. The terror attack on buses helping to evacuate a number of towns in Syria, which killed as many as 80 children on Saturday, has been widely condemned by humanitarian organisations. The UN has called for greater protection for children across the country. The huge blast targeted civilians waiting to leave rebel-held.
The Syrian army, also civilians, women and children. It's a horrific picture that just can't be described.
This is one of the worst, most horrifying massacres. We urge our president, Assad, to help our families out. What happened can't be described. Oh dear God, we don't know what to do.
Well, we can now cross live to our correspondent in Damascus, the Syrian capital, Lizzie Phelan. Good afternoon, Lizzie. What more do we know about the reaction? What kind of sense are we getting to what happened in Aleppo province on Saturday? There he is, according to a deal struck between the government and opposition forces.
There are so many dead here from the free